The courtroom was filled with tension, whispers, and judgment hanging in the air. Officer Caleb Carter, his cane tapping rhythmically, stood tall despite the blindfold that defined his world. His trusted partner, K9 Rocky, stood beside him, unwavering, as ever. But the judge, with a sneer, mocked them both, calling it a disgrace for a blind officer to serve, questioning his ability to function with his K9 Rocky, once a warrior on the streets, had been there through it all. Together, they had faced danger, helped countless lives, and kept the city safe. But today, they were not being judged for their service. They were being mocked. The judge's words stung, leaving Caleb, the blind officer, feeling the weight of every doubt cast on him and his partner. However, there was more to this than just a public trial. Caleb had been through far worse in his journey. The real test was ahead. Could a blind officer with his faithful K9 defy the odds once again and prove that courage does not come from sight? Or would this moment be their undoing? The stakes were high, and the true measure of courage was about to unfold. Would they rise above the mockery, or would they be pushed to the edge? Officer Caleb Carter and K9 Rocky had once been inseparable. The bond they shared was forged through years of service, countless hours training, and moments of life or death danger that only they understood. Rocky had been more than a partner. He had been Caleb's eyes, his protector, his best friend. Together, they had navigated the most difficult of missions with unwavering trust between them. But now, everything had changed. After the accident that had taken Caleb's sight, the world he once knew felt like a distant memory. He had grown, accustomed to relying on Rocky's guidance, but now, with his vision gone, everything felt different. He knew he needed to reconnect with his loyal companion, but the pain of their separation had left both of them in an unfamiliar place. The familiar comfort of the police station was now overwhelming. Caleb stood in the shelter's small courtyard, the sunlight breaking through the trees as he called to Rocky, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "Rocky, boy," he whispered, his heart heavy with hope and doubt. "Come here, boy." He could feel the air shift, could hear the sound of Rocky's paws as they tapped against the ground, but there was no response. Caleb's pulse quickened. Rocky had always been so quick to obey, yet now he remained still, as if he could not recognize Caleb's voice. Caleb's heart sank. He had worked tirelessly to train with Rocky, to form a bond stronger than anything he had ever known. The dog had always been quick to react, to protect, to help. But now, as Caleb stood there, trying to summon the connection they once shared, Rocky seemed distant, cold. The weight of the separation began to feel unbearable. Caleb had always known the risks of his job, the dangers that came with it, but never had he imagined that the one person he trusted most, his partner, would turn away from him. He stood frozen in place, his fingers curling around the handle of his cane as he waited for some sign of recognition, some spark of the bond that had once existed between them. The minutes felt like hours. Caleb called again, this time louder, more insistent, his voice echoing in the courtyard. "Rocky, come on, boy, it's me." Still there was no reaction. Caleb could feel his chest tightening, his breath shallow. What had happened to the dog who had always been there for him? What had happened to the bond they had built, piece by piece over the years? Across the courtyard, Rocky stood motionless, his head tilted slightly, as if trying to make sense of the sound he had just heard. Caleb's heart twisted in his chest. The hesitation in Rocky's movements was clear. The dog did not recognize the voice of his handler. His ears remained back, his body stiff as though confused by the unfamiliarity of the situation. A surge of frustration washed over Caleb. How could this be happening? How could the dog he had trusted with his life, the dog who had protected him through thick and thin, no longer recognize him? Had the accident, the injury, broken their connection forever? The harsh reality of the moment settled heavily on Caleb's shoulders. His once promising future in law enforcement had been torn apart by the accident, and now it seemed that his bond with Rocky was slipping through his fingers. Caleb had always been a fighter, but in that moment, he felt powerless. As the wind picked up, the sound of the leaves rustling seemed to pull Caleb from his thoughts. He shifted his stance, carefully adjusting his position as he stood, waiting. The familiar scent of Rocky, musky but comforting, lingered in the air. And Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to remember their past, their victories, their shared triumphs, their bond. A flash of memory washed over him. His first day with Rocky, the way the young, eager dog had looked up at him, eyes bright and full of energy. The way they had immediately clicked, instinctively knowing each other's rhythms. The countless hours spent in training, in the field, in moments when words were not necessary because they simply understood each other. The bond they had shared had been deeper than most could comprehend, but now all of that seemed so far away. Caleb tried again, speaking softly this time, hoping for the smallest sign of recognition. "Rocky," he whispered, his voice catching. "It's me. Please, come back to me." For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a small movement, a flicker in Rocky's eyes. The dog's head tilted again, his ears pricked forward. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. It was not much, but it was something. A spark of recognition, however faint. Rocky took a cautious step forward, his body still tense but his gaze more focused now. Caleb held his breath. The dog had not fully come back, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope. Caleb's heart swelled with both joy and sadness. He knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, and there would be days when the confusion and pain would return. But the connection, the flicker of recognition was still there. Caleb had not given up, and neither had Rocky. But the challenge ahead would not be simple. The bond between them, though still intact, needed to be rebuilt. Trust had to be regained, and healing would require patience from both sides. They had both been broken by the events that had transpired, but the journey to reconnect had just begun. For Caleb, the emotional reconnection mattered more than anything else. It was not just about proving his worth as an officer, but about proving to himself and to Rocky that they could overcome anything together. What was at stake was their partnership, their trust, and their shared future. Without it, Caleb would not be able to move forward in the world he had once known. And without it, Rocky would remain lost in the same confusion that had separated them. The emotional journey ahead was filled with uncertainty, but there was one thing Caleb knew for sure. He was not going to give up on Rocky. And as he listened to the soft patting of Rocky's paws on the ground, he realized that just like him, the dog was willing to fight for their bond. The question now was whether they could rebuild it, piece by fragile piece. The days that followed Caleb's tentative hope were filled with a mixture of small victories and painful setbacks. The initial spark of recognition that Rocky had shown was fragile, like the first bud of spring pushing through the frozen ground. Caleb had hoped that the breakthrough would be the beginning of their full reconnection, but the reality proved to be more complex. Caleb had always been a patient man. His work in the field had taught him the importance of strategy, timing, and discipline. But with Rocky, it had always been different. Their bond had been instantaneous, their communication seamless. There had been no need for patience. It had always come naturally. But now, patience was required, not just from him, but from Rocky as well. Each morning, Caleb would begin their routine. He would stand in the courtyard, calling Rocky's name in the same tone he had always used. "Rocky," he would say, his voice full of quiet determination. "Come on, boy." At first, there was no response, but Caleb had learned that his partner needed time. Slowly, he would move toward the familiar scent of the dog's fur, his footsteps purposeful, his heart brimming with both hope and fear. It took several days before Rocky finally acknowledged his presence with a small, hesitant movement. Just the smallest shift of his ears. Caleb's breath caught and he reached out a hand. "Come here, buddy," he murmured. For the first time, Rocky allowed Caleb to gently touch his head. It was not the enthusiastic greeting they once shared, but it was progress. Each time, Caleb repeated the same routine, sometimes for hours. He tried everything, bringing out Rocky's favorite toy, a red ball that had always elicited excitement from the dog. But when he tossed the ball, Rocky's gaze remained vacant. The dog didn't chase it. He simply stood still, watching Caleb with uncertainty. It was frustrating. Caleb's fingers tightened around his cane, the familiar object serving as a reminder of his own struggle. He had lost his sight, but he had not lost his sense of purpose. His connection with Rocky had always been more than just physical. It had been about trust, instinct, and the deep understanding that they shared. But now, even that connection seemed distant. Every day, Caleb would sit beside Rocky, feeling the quiet tension between them. He would remember the first time they had met, the way Rocky had bounded toward him during their first training session. Rocky had been so eager to prove himself. He had leapt with energy, ready to work, to be the best. That was the dog Caleb had known, the dog who had saved his life more times than he could count. But that dog seemed gone now, replaced by a creature who didn't know him, didn't recognize the bond they had formed. As the days turned into weeks, Caleb began to question himself. Was this even worth it? Was he being selfish, hoping for a connection that had been lost? Would he ever truly be able to get through to Rocky again? There were moments when he sat alone, his back against the wall of the shelter, and the pain of it all threatened to overwhelm him. He had been through so much already. The accident, the rehabilitation, the emotional strain of adjusting to a new life. It had all been so much. But now, with Rocky distant, Caleb felt like a part of himself was slipping away. There was a night 2 weeks into their journey when Caleb was feeling particularly defeated. He had come to the shelter after a long, tiring day. As he called Rocky's name, his voice cracking slightly, the dog didn't respond. Caleb sat on the floor, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The absence of the familiar sound of Rocky's paws, the joy of the dog's excited bark, it was almost more than he could bear. He closed his eyes, letting the silence surround him. His mind drifted to the past, to the days when he and Rocky had been a team, inseparable. The flashbacks came in waves, memories of their first mission together, the adrenaline rushing through him as Rocky had followed his commands without hesitation. The first time they had tracked down a suspect together, the way Rocky had signaled when it was safe to approach. There was a bond between them that had been formed in the field, something unspoken yet profoundly understood. Caleb had never known anything like it. The journey to reclaim the bond between Officer Caleb Carter and K9 Rocky had been long, filled with frustration, self-doubt, and endless hours of effort. For weeks, Caleb had tried every method he could think of to bring his partner back to him, to reawaken the connection that had once been second nature. Yet despite his best efforts, Rocky remained distant, still lost in the confusion of the past. It felt like every step forward was followed by 2 steps back. But today, Caleb could feel something was different. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the shelter courtyard. The air was heavy with the scent of fresh grass and earth, a smell that had always been comforting to both Caleb and Rocky. Caleb stood at the far end of the courtyard, his cane gently tapping the ground as he took slow, deliberate steps. "Rocky," he called out, his voice steady but full of longing. "Come here, boy." For a moment there was nothing. The silence between them was thick, almost unbearable. Caleb's heart rate quickened, but he kept his hand steady, waiting. It had been a long time since he had felt this kind of hope. A hope that, despite everything, had never fully faded. He had trained himself not to expect much from Rocky's response, knowing it would take time. But today, there was something in the air, something that told him this could be the moment. A shift, a slight movement. Caleb's ears perked up as he heard the faint sound of Rocky's paws scraping against the ground. The dog's head turned slightly, as though weighing Caleb's presence, and Caleb's heart leaped in his chest. He waited. Then, to his amazement, Rocky took a step forward. It was cautious at first, hesitant, as if unsure whether to trust the voice he had heard so many times before. Caleb held his breath, fingers tightening around his cane, urging himself, to remain calm. He couldn't let his emotions get ahead of him, but the hope that had been buried deep within him began to surface again. Slowly, Rocky advanced, his movements tentative, but more confident than they had been in the past weeks. Caleb remained perfectly still, not wanting to scare him off, but his mind raced. Was this really happening? Was Rocky finally coming back to him? As Rocky neared, Caleb could feel the presence of his dog growing stronger. There was an undeniable weight in the air, a sense of something being restored. The reunion that Caleb had been yearning for was at hand. Then it happened. Rocky stopped right in front of him. For a brief moment there was a hesitation, both of them frozen in place, unsure of how to proceed. Caleb's heart pounded as he slowly extended his hand toward Rocky's head, his palm facing outward. His fingers brushed against Rocky's fur, and in that instant everything changed. The dog's eyes, once distant, now focused, met Caleb's gaze. The recognition was there, undeniable. Rocky's ears perked up, his tail, barely noticeable at first, gave a small, tentative wag. And then, as though everything they had shared over the years came rushing back to him, Rocky's tail began to wag more vigorously. His whole body seemed to relax, his tension giving way to a joyful exuberance that Caleb had not seen in what felt like forever. Caleb, overwhelmed with emotion, dropped to his knees, his hand still resting on Rocky's head. The dog, his faithful partner, leaned into him with such force that Caleb had to brace himself. It was as though all the years of bond building, of shared experiences, of love and loyalty, had poured into this one moment of pure recognition. This was the dog Caleb had known, the dog who had always been there, ready to serve, ready to fight by his side. Tears welled up in Caleb's eyes as the weight of the moment settled in. This was it. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting, for Rocky had returned to him. The bond was not gone, it had simply been waiting, dormant until the right moment. The years of shared service, of love and mutual trust, had not been erased. It had been buried under layers of pain and confusion, but it was still there, and now it was back. Rocky licked Caleb's face, a playful, affectionate gesture that sent a wave of relief crashing through Caleb's body. It wasn't just recognition, it was the deep, instinctive understanding that they were still a team. They were still partners. They were still everything they had been before. The joy, the overwhelming relief Caleb felt in that moment was beyond anything he had experienced since the accident. It was triumphant. It was redemption. But then, just as quickly as the emotional flood came, a wave of doubt crept in. Was this really it? Had Rocky fully come back, or was this just a momentary flash of the past? Caleb had fought so hard for this, and he could not allow himself to believe that it would slip away so easily. As much as he wanted to savor the joy, he knew this was not the end of their journey. It was only a step forward. In the midst of the relief, Caleb noticed a small hesitation in Rocky's movements. For a split second, the dog pulled back, looking around as if uncertain, and Caleb could feel the emotional thread tighten again. The doubts, the insecurities, the pain, they were still there. This breakthrough was real, but it was fragile. It would take time for them to truly heal. But Caleb did not let that diminish the moment. He held onto Rocky, pressing his face into the dog's fur as if to tell him without words, "I am here, and I will never leave you." And for Rocky, as he nuzzled Caleb back, there was a quiet understanding that they were not yet fully healed, but they were on the right path. They still had more to overcome, more scars to heal, but together they could face whatever came next. This was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of the next chapter in their journey. The moment of recognition had been earned. The breakthrough was hard-won, filled with emotion, relief, and love, but also tinged with the understanding that their healing would take time. The road ahead was not without its challenges, but for now, they had each other, and that was enough. The emotional tension may have lifted, but the journey was far from over. Caleb and Rocky were still recovering, still learning to trust, but the bond that had always defined them was now more powerful than ever. Together, they would face the future, one step at a time. But as the silence stretched on, Caleb could feel himself growing more desperate. He had always been the one to take control, to guide others, but now he felt lost, adrift in a world without sight and without his partner. He wanted to reach for Rocky, to pull him close and remind him of everything they had shared, but instead he sat motionless, listening for any sign of movement. And then it happened. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Caleb heard the soft rustling of Rocky's fur. He held his breath. There, at the corner of the room, was the faintest shift. Rocky's head turned slightly in his direction. Caleb's heart leapt. He waited, silent, watching the dog's every movement. And then, for the first time in what felt like forever, Rocky moved toward him. It wasn't fast. It wasn't the excited rush Caleb had hoped for, but it was a step, a small but significant one. Rocky's eyes, though still clouded with uncertainty, locked onto Caleb's face. There was a moment, just a moment, when the dog's tail gave a small, hesitant wag. The breakthrough, when it came, was quieter than Caleb had expected, but it was undeniable. Rocky had come back to him, even if only a little. The connection, still fragile, was slowly being rebuilt. But even in that small victory, Caleb could not shake the uncertainty that still lingered. He knew that the road to recovery would be long, filled with emotional bumps and setbacks. There would be moments when the bond between them seemed stronger, but there would also be times when it felt like they were miles apart. Each time Rocky pulled back or failed to respond, Caleb's heart would break all over again. But there was hope. Caleb had learned, over the course of his career, that hope was often the most powerful weapon of all. It wasn't about what had been lost. It was about what could still be found. And so Caleb held on to that hope. Hope that together they could rebuild what had been broken. As the days went on, Caleb would continue to work with Rocky, inching closer to the bond they had once shared. It was not a perfect path, but it was theirs to walk together. The days following their breakthrough were filled with small steps forward and moments of quiet reflection. Caleb Carter and Rocky had not yet fully healed, but their bond was slowly being restored. Each day brought a new challenge, a new obstacle to face, but it also brought new signs of growth and progress, however small. Caleb still struggled with his blindness. He often found himself reaching for things that were no longer within his reach, trying to remember what his world had once been like. But the presence of Rocky beside him was a constant comfort. The dog had always been there for him, guiding him through difficult situations, protecting him when danger loomed. Now, Caleb was learning how to rely on Rocky in new ways, and he was beginning to understand that while he could no longer see with his eyes, he could still see with his heart and his trust in his partner. Every morning, Caleb would stand in the shelter courtyard and call out to Rocky, just as he had done before. Sometimes the dog would hesitate. Sometimes there would be moments of confusion, but each time Rocky would come to him, slowly but surely. There were still moments of doubt, but Caleb had learned to recognize them as part of the healing process. Bond between them had not simply been restored, it had evolved. Rocky had grown too. He was no longer just the dog who had followed Caleb's commands. He was now a partner in every sense of the word. Rocky's patience and trust in Caleb had grown stronger, as had Caleb's understanding of his own emotions. They were learning, day by day, how to communicate in new ways, relying on the unspoken connection that had always existed between them. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult training session where Caleb had struggled to guide Rocky through an obstacle course, Caleb sat on the ground, his hand resting on Rocky's fur. They were both exhausted, but there was a sense of peace between them. Caleb closed his eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of calm. "You know, buddy," Caleb murmured, "I thought I had lost you. I thought we'd never get back to the way we were." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "But I see now. We don't need to be the same, we just need to move forward." Rocky lay beside him, his head resting on Caleb's knee. His breathing was steady, and for the first time in weeks, Caleb felt like they had truly come full circle. They were no longer the same officer and K9 team they had once been, but they were something stronger, a team built on resilience, patience, and love. As they spent more time together, the daily moments of healing began to feel less like efforts and more like natural exchanges. Caleb learned to let go of his old expectations, understanding that their bond could not be rushed or forced. It was something that had to be nurtured and allowed to grow at its own pace. And in doing so, Caleb began to learn new ways of seeing the world, not just through Rocky's eyes, but through the emotional connection they shared. Their journey had not been easy. They had both faced setbacks and moments of doubt, but each time they hit a roadblock, they had found a way to keep moving forward. It was not about returning to the past. It was about learning from it and moving toward a future that was unknown but full of possibility. There were still days when Rocky would pull back or hesitate. There were still moments when Caleb would feel the weight of his blindness more acutely than others. But these moments were fewer now. The healing process was not linear, but there was a rhythm to it that felt familiar and comforting. Caleb had learned to trust not only in Rocky but in himself. He had learned that healing was a gradual, messy process that required both time and trust. The bond they shared was no longer about what had been lost. It was about what they had gained in the process. They had learned to navigate the world differently, but they were doing it together. Rocky had become more than just a dog to Caleb. He had become a symbol of loyalty, of second chances, and of the strength that could come from adversity. As the sun began to set on another day, Caleb and Rocky sat side by side, watching the colors of the sky change. There was no need for words, no need for grand gestures. They were simply content in each other's company, knowing that the journey they had started was far from over, but that they were no longer facing it alone. If you believe in the power of second chances and the strength of loyalty, then Caleb and Rocky's story is one that will resonate deeply. Together, they have shown us that healing is not linear, and sometimes the greatest bonds are built through patience and perseverance. If you have been touched by their journey, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories that prove the unbreakable connection between humans and their loyal companions. Every story is a reminder that no matter the challenges, love and trust can help us rise again. Join us for more inspiring tales, and remember, the journey of healing is always worth the fight. Thank you for being a part of this incredible story. Stay tuned for more moments that will touch your heart and leave you reflecting on the true meaning of loyalty, healing, and second chances.